This is the Coaching Leader Podcast, a podcast about coaching, leadership, and leading through coaching. And here's your host, Scott Gress.
Welcome to the Coaching Leader Podcast, and this is the second episode now of our interview with Dr. David Luecke. In the previous Coaching Leader episode, we listened to him talk about the management perspective, which includes marketing and some of those other business-related ideas that can be used in ministry. And now in this episode, he's talking about things from his PhD in organizational behavior. And he's talking about how people think nowadays and how they perceive things differently and how we can meet them where they are. Certainly not changing the way of salvation at all, but how we can be responsive to people now. And I encourage you to listen carefully, and I'm sure that you'll be blessed by it. So here's the second part of our interview with Dr. David Luecke. Well, let's shift to the behavioral science perspective that you had presented to me. And it's really kind of a follow-up with a lot that we've already been talking about. But what do you see as the sociology of New Testament ministry and the work of Paul and Jesus?
It's become almost a new frontier through the work of Warren Meeks, a New Testament scholar, about 40 years ago. And that is to look at what was happening in Jesus' time. He was a wandering rabbi who had a flair about him, and he attracted big audiences, partly, or I'd even say mostly, because he taught in ways people could understand, parables.
Yeah.
And the parables that he taught had a punch to them that get lost in translation. They always had a surprise ending, like in the Good Samaritan, and the fact that it's a Samaritan actually does the help, not the religious leaders. And the challenge for us preachers and teachers today is to make that punch just as lively now as it did then. One translation would see the local atheist actually helping the person in need when the religious and civil leaders just passed by. They didn't have time for it. Always that punch, the Pharisee and the publican. Pharisee had no concept of humility, but it's this lowly publican tax collector that knew how to do it. Consistently, Jesus taught in stories. And it's getting back to those stories that's our challenge today, especially when they have a punchline to them. So it's the sociology of Jesus, and people love the way he stood up to the religious authorities of his days, the Pharisees. He loathed the Pharisees and just incredibly critical of them. Well, that went over well. And he met the end that we all know, but that's part of the attraction too. I just talked with a fellow pastor who is going in for knee replacement tomorrow. He's had the other knee done. He knows he's in for a lot of pain because he's experienced it all. So why is he doing it? For a better life. Well, compare the pain of Christ, especially during Holy Week and the scourging and then death on the cross. Why did he do it? Because of a better life that he's giving to other people. I don't know quite why I went to that illustration, except that it was fresh in mind, but it's understanding Jesus in the sociological context of his time. Now, another part of the sociology is to recognize, for instance, Reformation time and all of the culture that went into that. And Luther was big on brand management. The brand was Luther himself and how he stood up against authorities. And if you know the history, it's amazing he survived all those years.
Yeah.
Well, we're still living in a Reformation culture where the big issues are justification and sanctification. That makes sense to a culture shaped by Latin and the Roman view of life. That's gone. People don't understand the vocabulary, and there's really not, it's not worth the effort to try to teach them around those concepts of justification and sanctification. Better yet is being made right with God. How do you get right with God? And I've learned sanctification is kind of hopeless. So I learned to translate it into becoming more Christ-like, very Pauline. And the Spirit helps us become more like Christ. And by the way, the Spirit makes that life enjoyable, love, joy, peace, patience, and so forth. So it's right, and I think helpful to say, by grace we are saved for eternity. By grace we are saved for a better life now. And it's getting to that better life now that's all in Paul throughout, and communicating that's what we're doing. Lutherans are kind of notorious. I once preached a sermon and got criticized afterwards that I was preaching sanctification, and Lutherans don't do that. We're that's the mentality we're dealing with. Don't even fiddle around with sanctification. Talk about becoming more like Christ. Well,
Yeah.
that's on sociology, and I think I gave you sociological insights in terms of the sacred canopy culture and the modernist culture, and now the postmodernist. And a lot of people can't fathom that and are very insistent on thinking in sacred canopy terms. Pastors do that because that's what they grew up in. That's what they know. Getting to heaven is the primary goal. That's a Reformation concept. It's not a concept that appeals much to young people today. We live a much better life. Let's talk about this life, not just what's going to happen afterwards.
Yeah. So can you say a little bit more about what it is that is the itch that people want scratched now, what they're really yearning for? You know, you had mentioned relationships, and I'm surely there's loneliness out there. Can you say more about that?
Meaning in life, purpose,
Mm-hmm.
which just doesn't exist out uh, in the general sociology of our times. What am I here for? How can I live better than what I'm living now? Plus, this is a surprise to many modernists, a great openness to the spirit and spiritual world. Miracles don't faze them. Quite open to that, and quite open to a supernatural force that somehow affects life today. Those of us who thought we were adapting to the modern scientific era have a hard time understanding that the people who've gone through that phase just don't think that way anymore.
So emphasizing the work of the Spirit in Word and Sacrament is totally reception. Folks are much more receptive to that whole idea. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and I want,
Probably more.
well, yeah, a lot more, but I was word and sacraments. That's, of course, a truism among Lutherans, but it's changed a lot from 100 years ago, even when communion was celebrated once a month. Actually, if you go back into the 18th century, it was celebrated once a quarter.
Oh yeah.
It had a lot of meaning when the pastor went around to individual families to prepare them for the Lord's Supper. Very pastoral. Well, I grew up in a parsonage, and we kids would take telephone messages of somebody announcing for communion. Well, that was still a vestige of the old, but when kids take the message and write it on a piece of paper, something got lost.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think we're coming through a phase where the sacraments just took on a lot more importance than they used to have. Word always takes precedence over the sacraments, which are an expression of the word. I think traditional churches in general, but Lutherans in particular, just took a wrong turn when we went very liturgical and made such a big thing out of the sacraments. They're important. I'm not questioning them,
Sure.
but the receptivity out there to the sacramental side is limited. I'll just say that our local Christian radio kicked the Lutheran hour out and wouldn't broadcast them because they talked about baptism so much. Well, we have our own vocabulary,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is God comes to us. That's the central message. But they can't fathom how a little bit of water is going to save anybody. So you can fight, you can try to explain it, but why? Keep the emphasis on the word, keep the emphasis on the message that's central in Jesus and Paul, and skip all those intervening centuries where things got warped in ways that are just astounding for us to look back on. When in doubt, go back to the originals.
There you go. So help me with some maybe some concrete examples of what that might look like to be, wise pastors and church leaders to shape ministry at this time. Emphasis on the word and so forth.
Well, being known in the community for the service you offer. Royal Redeemer is a large congregation. We we worship before the pandemic about 900. And one of the vital ministries we call Servant Saturday. And we get 300 people to show up on a Saturday morning to go out and serve mostly the elderly who aren't able to keep up on yard work and house cleaning. So that's very concrete. We're well known. We have the North Royalton Food Pantry. So we're very involved with the community. That's where evangelism starts, showing you have something worthwhile to offer. We have a large preschool and K to 8 school. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we didn't have any school at all. So it built up so that now we're the largest school in the Ohio district. Well, that's a source of ministry. Parents want something special for their kids. They're not happy with public schools for all sorts of understandable reasons, centering around the teaching that God didn't create the world, it just happened. And so we do have a young congregation, but it's because we are doing things that draw attention to us in the community and deliver on the promise. I don't know what to say to pastors of small congregations. It's just very difficult. And the best way that I know forward is to work on community and personal relationships. I don't quite have that skill myself to sit down at Panera and try to initiate discussions with other people. We hear about folks that can do that. As far as I know, it's a relatively small population of extroverts that can pull that off. If a pastor happens to have that skill, good things might come out of it. Otherwise, focus on community and focus on trying to reach beyond the people that you have and letting them be your guide to how to do that. As I said earlier, it's a tough market out there. And the traditional small village church just doesn't hack it anymore. Another way of expressing that, a little different angle, is traditional churches lived on guilt, laying guilt on people. back to the village where this is the Christian life, and if you don't do that, there's something wrong with you. Guilt doesn't cut it anymore. And our whole theological pastoral system is based on guilt. Pastors would say this is what a good Christian should do, with the implication you should do that. And that's not a very good motivator. Motivation is another basic lesson I learned in business school. How do you motivate workers? How do you motivate anybody? And the old guilt structure works to the effect that it reduces the guilt people feel, but it doesn't produce high performance of Christian life. We can talk about cultural Christianity, having a cultural faith, which can be very, very affirming. I've grown up and known cultural Lutherans who are very upstanding, but that's a long way from being a convicted faith, where I've had tests, and I've come out of that much more convinced of what I believe. I don't think the future is going to be very good for cultural faith as the culture just disintegrates around us. Churches that do well are going to be ones that work off of convicted faith. Now, there isn't anything humanly we can do to lead one to believe in a way that's convicted of personal investment. That's the Holy Spirit's work. And that's why we need to revitalize Paul's understanding of the Spirit. It's kind of the missing link in understanding his theology. It's the missing link between justification and sanctification. The Spirit was very lively in Luther's early years, and then the Peasants' Revolt happened, where 100,000 peasants were slaughtered because they were doing what the Spirit led them to do. They were in revolt. Luther was much tamer after that. Well, it's the Pentecostals today who are getting our attention again, and they are the ones that we have a lot to learn from.
Yeah, and as I think of your words, and I think of even small churches that look for ways to build relationships and connect with those people outside of their four walls. And then as I think of people who are in our society who are searching for meaning, you can probably put the two together. That even a non-member, a non-believer can join with the group of Christians to do something for the elderly in their yard work or their housework or whatever. And along the way, they're going to experience community with those Christians that they're hanging around with doing this service. They'll feel like they did something meaningful.
Very meaningful.
They'll maybe hear the prayer or devotion if they started the day with that. There'll be conversation at cups of coffee or breaks along the way. And I bet they'll probably hear about Jesus somewhere along there too.
And they catch it.
Yeah.
You teach it, they catch it from other Christians who are living out their Christian life. We also make a big deal about a night to shine, which is to do a celebration for mentally challenged, I think is the current word.
Mm-hmm.
That sells big.
Yeah.
And we've taken over a whole Holiday Inn in their whole facility, and you could just feel the Spirit at work. Everybody loved it because they were doing something for people that were in need, and they could see the immediate payoff. It's a Tim Tebow program. Couldn't do it very well this year because of the pandemic, but that's become a high spot. And I know that we all need to know that young adults don't contribute to institutions anymore. The older generation was trained to that. They contribute to causes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where a lot of the money comes from for the night to shine. Doesn't do well for church budgets that have a lot of staff to pay.
Yeah.
It involves trying to explain why we have all these overhead institutional costs. But if you want to get young people engaged, they'll do that by doing service projects and then supporting service projects. Whole different mentality than what we grew up with.
And along the way, those things are, well, I use the word sort of excuses to get to know people and talk to them and build a relationship, and the activity is almost secondary, but the so you need to give attention to the people you're meeting along the way and inviting to join you who may not or may be far from the Lord. So it's beautiful.
You got to start where they are, and where they are is not where their grandparents were.
And you're not there to win the argument. You're there to just make friends.
So much of traditional evangelism is off-putting,
Mm-hmm.
especially when you come with the vocabulary of heaven and hell. I used to live in Pasadena, and you don't see it on television, but at the end of the Rose Parade,
Yeah.
Spears was a very scruffy looking guy with a big banner that said repent or go to hell or some version on that. What was that accomplishing?
I give up.
How many people were repelled by that? Certainly the cameras didn't show it. They're not interested in that at all. So we've got a lot of unlearning to do.
Oh, for sure. Well, you mentioned in your email something that I wasn't familiar with, and maybe you've already talked about it, but not labeled it as such. But what is the new psychology of spiritual temperaments?
People have different pathways to God,
Okay.
things that resonate with them. The term emerged with applications of the Myers-Briggs personality inventory, very popular in businesses. I found the best expression is in a book by Gary Thomas, who talks about 9 pathways. And pathways are where you feel closest to God. One easily understood one is out in nature, the naturalists whose pathway they feel closer to God in nature. It's not me, but they do. Another one is caregiver. I really enjoy watching caregivers emerge in church life, Sunday services, and how they'll be attracted to the person in a wheelchair or with some physical disability, and they really enjoy ministering. That's their pathway. I've had clinical pastoral training. I know how to do it, but that's not my thing.
Yeah.
Uh, Another one would be peace and justice issues,
Mm-hmm.
which have become sort of the dominant piety in liberal churches, that they are committed to a cause that expresses their understanding of the Christian faith. The two most significant pathways are that of the enthusiast and the intellectual. Well, I have to mention another one. There are people find closeness to God in tradition. They're the liturgical people who just thrive on all of the symbolism. Not many of them, very small segment of the population. But I'll talk about the enthusiasts. They are the ones who enjoy emotions, emotional expression in worship. We're all trained to look down on that because how can they be sure of what's certain? And all the attitudes of the other category, the intellectuals. But it's real out there, and as I've said several times, it's the Pentecostals who are showing the way to a revitalization of the Christian faith. I'm an intellectual. I have lots of books, 4,000 of them in my library here and in the basement. I love reading and analyzing. And that analysis, by the way, is part of what you learn in business school, how to analyze a situation. Mainline church bodies have been led by intellectuals, theologians typically, And mainline church bodies appeal to a better educated segment of society. Think of it as the bell-shaped curve. The average is in the middle, and it goes down, and then it flattens out on the ends. Well, mainline churches have appealed to the right side as it flattens out, the top 20% or so of the population. What about the other 80%?
Yeah, yeah.
Midway is kind of average, and either side of it would be average. Who worries about the people on the lower left side? The mentally challenged are there. That's very obvious. But so are a whole lot of other people who just don't process with their mind as well as they process with their heart and their emotions. And it's those enthusiasts who broke off from mainline churches over the centuries. They just weren't getting fed, and developed the onshoot, the denominations, the offshoots that we don't know what to do with from our intellectual viewpoint. The holy rollers, as they were called. Now, the Pentecostal churches are changing a lot too to recognize that they need to have more intellectual content. So the traditional Pentecostals of 100 years ago aren't like the progressive Pentecostal churches today. My point is that the enthusiasts and the intellectuals are on two different pathways to God. And the intellectual pathway just isn't doing very well anymore. People want more immediate access. Their temperament is different. And it's a better understanding of the psychology of temperaments that open up that perspective. Within a congregation, I think it's an interesting challenge to get the nature people some time together, help them organize so they can do events out in parks and people where they feel closer to God. So you can get the caregivers together. They kind of know who they are. This night to shine, they love it. They emerge by the dozens wanting to express that kind of care. That's a frontier within a congregation, and it happens much better digitally than it does just by personal contacts. Churches today have to live digitally, and post-pandemic, they need to be able to have a hybrid experience. I've heard it referred to, part in person, but also part digitally. The digital world is doing lots of damage to young people who are dispersed and really can't think very clearly on topics. But it's got to be digital in the future, just so that, in fact, people can participate in whatever setting they're in. And in the process, hopefully find people who think like they think. And I think that's organizing ability. I'm a natural organizer. I've made my living for 20 years as a vice president and administrator, and I can see that most people can't think in those terms. And it takes examples to show what can be done.
So people are kind of wired differently and think differently, and it's to our detriment to assume that one approach is going to have to reach the whole crowd, but we're going to have to be sensitive to how people think and how they're wired, to be more intentional in I guess not only shepherding them, but also in bringing them closer to Jesus in the first place.
Leadership, that's called.
Yeah.
Organizational leadership. We haven't talked about megachurches.
Okay.
But that's the future, and they are growing. And they have a ministry that sort of goes across the board of what we're talking about. And surprisingly, a lot of young adults are in megachurches. they can be kind of unanimous off to the side until they're comfortable. But then there are a lot of avenues to pursue your Christian life within a megachurch, and you find people like yourself, and they're good at organizing, so you can find people like yourself. Um, and they're led typically by very good leaders who often have a business background, and they have tremendously skillful preachers. You don't get to be a megachurch without a very skilled preacher, way beyond the abilities of most of us. Bill Hybels at Willow Creek Community Church has been the big example. I've listened to some of his sermons and just sit back and, wow, that was really well said.
Yeah.
Rick Warren is another one. And his purpose driven church, I think, is just an excellent example of what it is that, of the message that fits our times today. Well, they also, mega churches have organizers, administrative pastors, programs, and they work hard at honing those programs so that they actually meet the audience they intend. It's a particularly unique American institution, and I think it has a bright future. And we love to look down on mega churches because they're not like us. Well, thank God they're not like us. They're doing a better job than we are.
Yeah, if you were going to start something from scratch without your assumptions on how it should be, you might end up with some of those models, wouldn't you?
You would. And
Uh,
my consistent message for 40 years now is go look at the growing churches and learn what you can from them. And a big part of that is worship.
mhm.
It's much more lively and engaging worship. And I think our traditional liturgy, just as I said before, took a wrong turn. It just doesn't meet the market that's out there today. Very hard for churches to learn other than, very hard for pastors to learn other than from their heritage. But it's a grim future out there if you don't learn.
Yeah, there certainly is a trend towards churches merging, consolidation, churches all kind of becoming multi-campuses of one particular congregation. There's numerous expressions of that here in South Florida. You think about uh, Life Church throughout the United States and so forth. And they only want to concentrate on about 5 things and do it well. So there's a stewardship of their efforts and so forth. There's a lot of that makes sense there, and it might be uh, a shape of things to come in our Lutheran denomination if we continue to lose pastors and lose churches, and we're going to have to come up with a way to manage that all and provide that leadership.
Well, the skills to do that are rare.
Mm.
And therefore, we need to be much better able to sort out who has the skills and who doesn't. That doesn't fit traditional models of ministry.
Yeah, and to admit that one is needed and the other not so much, that takes that bit of humility and analytical skill as well, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Oh, well, is there speaking of leadership, I really appreciate that spiritual temperament piece there. Speaking of leadership, though, what would you say about that need for leadership? And since as a coach, the value of coaching or mentoring, anything you want to add there? Kind of throwing you a curveball.
No, that's all right. And it's a good curveball. And one of the hottest topics in business schools today is changing corporate cultures.
Yeah.
And it takes skill. There are people who write about that. And you start small and you do things that are successful and gradually build up confidence in the new culture. That's hard. And it takes, as I said before, a lot of skill. And most pastors don't have the ability to do that. They think the way forward is with contemporary worship, certainly in that direction, but boy, you have to do it well.
Yeah.
Deciding to put different music on the stand on a Sunday morning is not going to accomplish much of anything. It took at least a decade for us at Royal Redeemer to become good at contemporary worship, and we still debate how best to do that. All of which underscores, yes, change people, get them excited in new ways about ministry, but then recognize you're probably going to run into a brick wall, and you need to dedicate a good decades of your ministry to trying to change that congregational culture. There's another insight from social sciences, and that is the emphasis on culture. A culture is the beliefs, values, and behaviors of a congregation. Traditional churches excel at beliefs, talk about values, but don't really do much in behavior change and aren't really that interested. You look back and you say, how could they do that? That they didn't actually deliver on what they believe. And the whole shift is, who cares about beliefs today as long as they are conservative, biblically oriented? There are lots of denominational disputes and history shaping words that all keep us separate, but those are kind of in the past. I think it's the mission field where true unity is going to happen as you get ready to reach out to new people in new ways. And then you go back to Paul's thinking, and Paul was very clear on changing church cultures and teaching church cultures. He talked about moving beyond beyond milk to greater things. I always thought that meant meaning more theology. I was a theology geek at one time in my life. I think he was talking community. I'm going to teach you how to live in community together. And so case after case after case, that's what he was teaching. And ultimately, it's the behavior that counts.
And just because you offer a contemporary service at 9:30 with somebody standing up front with a guitar isn't going to do it.
I've seen some pretty pitiful examples of that. Yes.
Yeah, it's not a silver bullet or a key program, but it's that consistent and persistent new behaviors and like you say, those successes that build on one another, and you're just dogged in your determination about it. Oh, well, there's so much here to talk about. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our hearers before we conclude today?
I'm looking over my notes.
Okay.
I think I covered pretty much what I want.
Well, good. How about tell us about your blog and your ebooks and how we might have folks get in touch with you?
Well, my basic website is www.whathappened.church. .church is a new domain now. And there I have 104 blogs so far that I've weekly sent out.
Awesome.
Quite a milestone. And there also I have free books that summarize these blogs. I do it by half a year, 26 blogs in a book. And I'm working now on what will be the 5th book. They're all free for the downloading. And you can find that under the resource section of whathappened.church. And there also is how to make contact. But I'm quite happy to give out my email address.
Oh, please do.
dsluecke@aol.com.
dsluecke,
Luecke.
at aol.com.
Right.
Wonderful. Well, I can't tell you how grateful I am for you spending the time and sharing your thoughts with us. Challenging, but encouraging at the same time. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. I enjoyed it.
Thank you to Dr. David Luecke for his time and wisdom these past 2 episodes. And thank you, the listener. And I hope that you took something out of these episodes and that you were also challenged. We here at the Coaching Leader are all about growing people for ministry, focusing in the areas of leadership, discipleship, and growing healthy teams. And in that regard, there's a new tool, free for download off scottgress.com, called the Leadership Assessment Wheel, helping you know where to focus for leadership growth, and also a tool that you can use for the leadership development and growth of your team. Reach out to me. I'd be happy to make a presentation to your team or to your group and talk about how you could use this tool and follow a process for your own and the leadership growth of your team. So God bless you. God bless you in your leadership development and in your leadership. And we look forward to seeing you next time on The Coaching Leader.